Here is a clip from August 13th, which is yesterday, of Itamar Ben-Gvir, the head of the national security for Israel's government, the rough equivalent of the head of our FBI, leading a few thousand Zionist fanatics into the Al-Aqsa Mosque in East Jerusalem. I want you to watch this, and I'd like you to listen to what he says. There is a translation, and then let us know what you think is the significance of this, cut number 10.
We are at the Temple Mount on Tisha B'Av. Today we commemorate the destruction of the temple, but we must also honestly acknowledge that there is significant progress here regarding the governance and sovereignty. The sight of Jews praying, as I said, our policy is to permit prayer. But I'll say something else. We must win this war. We must win, not go to summits in Doha or in Cairo, but defeat them. Bring them to their knees. That's the message. We can defeat Hamas, bring it to its knees.
Chris, if you have it, you can run some of the B-roll. You'll see, Aaron, Zionists lying down with their arms spread out in a cross mimicking, but preventing people from entering the mosque. What's the significance of Zionists in the Al-Aqsa Mosque?
Well, this is an extremist Zionist who said the most incendiary racist things about Palestinians for a long time, deliberately trying to provoke Palestinians by visiting the third holiest site in Islam. And this is nothing new. Whenever Israel wants to foreclose any possibility of diplomacy, of peace, and wants to basically incite Palestinians into violence that could then hasten a brutal Israeli crackdown, war of aggression against them, they do things like this. They visit the Al-Aqsa compound. This is what Ariel Sharon did back on September 28th, 2000. This was right after the so-called peace talks in Camp David failed between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat, mediated by Bill Clinton. And there was growing resentment at that time of the occupation, Israel's refusal to end the occupation. The message to Palestinians was that you have to accept, just complete surrender and these major West Bank settlement blocks if you want to have peace. That was the message of the failed peace process. So at the time of growing anger about that, and fears of even worse, Ariel Sharon goes and visits the Al-Aqsa compound, accompanied by hundreds of armed guards, and he got what he wanted. He provoked Palestinians. This elicited some people, throwing stones, which then Israel used as a pretext to launch a massive wave of violence, just gunning people down as they always do. So I think that what is being done here is a similar playbook, trying to provoke Palestinians more, trying to remind them that Israel claims the right to control their lives, to control their holiest sites, and feels biblically endowed to do so. And the timing is peculiar because Israel is like a little bit more pressure now to finally agree to the ceasefire hostage deal that it's been avoiding for so long. You have U.S. officials speaking a bit more forcefully now about Netanyahu holding up the deal. So I would suspect that what he's doing here is trying to incite some sort of provocation to do his part in foreclosing any possibility of a deal.
Chris, can you put up the full screen of Smotrich? This is Ben-Gvir's colleague on the hard right in the cabinet, basically saying that it's in Hebrew, as you can see, but the headline is that a deal for a ceasefire is effectively a surrender deal. So I guess there is still pressure on Netanyahu from these two, who, if they pull out of his government, Netanyahu is a caretaker rather than the prime minister.
Correct. And he faces prison time because he'll no longer be able to avoid a trial by virtue of being in office. We're talking about someone here, Smotrich, who recently complained that the world won't let Israel starve the 2 million people of Gaza, which he said would be justified and moral to starve 2 million people if it could free the hostages. That's what he said. But of course, he doesn't want to free the hostages because he knows, just as Netanyahu knows, that there's a deal on the table which everyone except for them have accepted, but which Netanyahu has been stalling because he wants to prolong his political career. And also he wants to destroy Gaza. He doesn't want to let that enclave exist anymore because it's the center of Palestinian resistance. So therefore, it has to be destroyed. And whether the people there survive, he doesn't care. He wants them all. He wants as many Palestinians to leave Gaza as possible. That's his only goal. And that's why Netanyahu's been lying through his teeth about the ceasefire deals. He said recently that it was Hamas that added a bunch of new conditions that made a ceasefire deal impossible. It's a complete lie. Even the New York Times was forced to admit recently that Netanyahu was lying. The Times had a headline saying, in the typical Times way of downplaying Israeli rejectionism, said that Israel was less flexible in recent ceasefire talks, less flexible, which means in the real world, Israel is blocking a ceasefire deal because, as the Times admits in the article, again, very reluctantly, I think, Netanyahu added a bunch of new conditions. He wants basically for Israel to control the corridor between Gaza and Egypt after previously saying it would withdraw from controlling all the border areas, and also wants to screen every single Palestinian coming back to their home in the north. So basically so for Hamas to accept that deal, they'd have to basically cede control of the north of Gaza to Israel. Which is a non-starter for Hamas. They're not going to do that, which Netanyahu knows, which is why he's imposed those conditions, which is why he's also lying about it. And where is the U.S. in calling him out on this? They've, put out some rumblings of this, but if they were being honest, this is what Biden would be going before the world and saying that Netanyahu is the only obstacle, and he's withholding all U.S. military support because of Netanyahu's stance, which of course Biden refuses to do.
Is it any wonder that Hamas has said we're not going to negotiate with these people? First of all, you assassinated our chief negotiator. Secondly, every time we agree to something, you up the ante. This is not a negotiation that you want. It's a capitulation, and we're not going to capitulate.
I think it's a totally reasonable stance. I mean, what other conclusion can you draw from an Israeli government that, as you said, assassinates the top negotiator, that keeps adding new non-starter conditions while falsely claiming it's the other side doing so, that has repeatedly assassinated people engaged in negotiations? Hamas leaders before Haniyeh had been killed by Israel as they carried out negotiations, that has, used the so-called peace process, which was supposed to lead to a Palestinian state, in theory, to accelerate the colonization of the Palestinian land that would be a part of any future Palestinian state, thereby making such a Palestinian state impossible. So what do you do with people like that? Choosing to not to negotiate at this point, I think, is a very reasonable stance. A former national security advisor for Israel named Gira Island recently said that the Middle East only understands the language of force, which was a complete projection. It's only Israel that understands force and seeks to use force to basically impose its hegemony and to scare everybody around it into submission. And the lesson that they're teaching everyone now is that it's basically only violence that will resolve anything. Iran and Hezbollah have yet to retaliate against Israel. And we have to think about why. I mean, maybe there's something strategic there, but also I think both countries are still holding out hope for a ceasefire deal and are basically saying to Israel, this is your last chance to avoid violence. But Israel, consumed with hegemony, consumed with supremacy, it's actually impossible for it to look at anybody else in the region as equal actors worth negotiating with and worth giving some sort of nod to. So Israel's put the whole region and the world in a very difficult position where violence seems to be the only answer that it will respond to.